Three books of the New Testament weren't written by the person whose name is on them, and almost every scholar agrees. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. These are the pastoral epistles. They claim to be from Paul, but the evidence says otherwise. And the reason they were written tells us something fascinating about how early Christians fought over Paul's legacy. So let's start with the basics. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and the Titus are three short letters in the New Testament. They're called the Pastoral Epistles because they depict Paul in a pastoral role, a shepherd guiding his flock. In these letters, Paul writes to two of his younger associates, Timothy and Titus, giving them instructions on how to lead churches. He assigns leadership roles, establishes rules for governance, and warns against false teachers. Right? Think of them as management manuals for early Christian communities, written as personal letters from the great apostle to his trusted delegates. That's the surface picture. Now here's where it gets interesting. Most scholars across the theological spectrum conclude Paul did not write these letters. The technical term is pseudonymous, meaning written under a false name. Pseudepigraphy was a recognized practice in the ancient world. Writers composed texts in the name of a revered teacher to extend that teacher's tradition. It wasn't necessarily fraud. It was a way of saying, this is what Paul would say if he were here. The evidence for pseudonymity falls into four categories. First, style and vocabulary. The pastorals contain over 300 words not found anywhere in Paul's undisputed letters. The 7 letters virtually all scholars agree Paul wrote: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. The sentence structures differ too. Second, theology. Paul's undisputed letters pulse with apocalyptic urgency and justification by faith. The pastorals replace that with sound doctrine. Faith becomes correct belief, something to guard and preserve. Third, church structure. Paul's churches had charismatic, fluid leadership. The pastorals describe bishops, elders, and deacons in a formal hierarchy. Fourth, social positions. The pastorals enforce household codes. Women must be silent, slaves must obey. The patriarchal order is affirmed. Compare that to Galatians 3:28, where Paul declares there is no male and female. These 4 lines of evidence converge. No single argument is decisive on its own, but together they build a powerful cumulative case. So if Paul didn't write them, when were they written? Here's a key piece of evidence. Around the 140s CE, a Christian teacher named Marcion assembled the first known canon list, a collection of authoritative scriptures. His list included an edited Gospel of Luke and the 10 letters of Paul, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. Notice what's missing. No 1 Timothy, no 2 Timothy, no Titus. If Marcion didn't know these letters, they may not yet have existed. This supports a date in the early to mid-2nd century, decades after Paul's death. But the most fascinating question isn't just who wrote them or when, it's why. After Paul died around the early 60s CE, different Christian communities claimed his authority, and they used that authority for radically opposed visions of Christian life. 2 trajectories emerged. The first, the pro-household trajectory, represented by the Pastoral Epistles. Here, the church is modeled on the Roman household. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, sits at the top. Women are subordinate. Slaves are obedient. Children fall below. Marriage is affirmed. Social order is preserved. The second, the anti-household trajectory, represented by a text called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. In this story, Paul preaches against marriage, against sex, against the entire household structure. A woman named Thecla hears Paul preach, leaves her fiancé, cuts her hair, and baptizes herself. Paul's gospel disrupts hierarchy rather than reinforcing it. Same apostle, opposite messages. This is what happens when a founding figure's legacy is contested. So what exactly was the pastoral author fighting against? The letters attack a specific set of teachings. First, myths and endless genealogies, referenced in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and the Titus chapter 1, possibly elaborate cosmological narratives or Jewish legendary expansions. Second, forbidding marriage, 1 Timothy chapter 4. Ascetic movements rejected household life entirely. This is exactly the trajectory we see in the Thecla story. Third, dietary asceticism, also 1 Timothy 4, abstaining from certain foods, possibly connected to Jewish food laws or broader ascetic practice. Fourth, wine abstinence. 1 Timothy 5:23 tells Timothy to take a little wine for your stomach, pushing back against those who drink only water. Fifth, what the author calls falsely called gnosis, 1 Timothy 6:20. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. This may target early movements later associated with Gnosticism. Sixth, the claim that the resurrection has already happened, 2 Timothy 2:18. This is realized eschatology, the belief that end-time events have already occurred spiritually. These aren't random heresies. They form a coherent opponent profile that fits second-century religious movements. Step back and look at the full picture. The Pastoral Epistles are a window into how early Christianity actually worked. There was no single orthodox Christianity from the start. Competing groups used the same apostolic authorities to authorize different visions of Christian life. The Pastorals won. They made it into the canon. The Acts of Paul and Thecla did not. The version of Paul that survived is largely the domesticated pro-household Paul. Understanding pseudonymity isn't about catching a forger, it's about understanding how authority, identity, and tradition were constructed in the ancient world. Writing in Paul's name was a way of claiming Paul's voice for a new generation facing new problems. The next time you read 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, or Titus, you're not reading Paul's words to his friends. You're reading one side of a second-century argument about what Paul really meant and what the church should look like. And the other side of that argument is mostly lost, but knowing it existed changes everything. And these letters aren't just theology, they're evidence of a battle. And the battle shaped the Christianity that followed.